I was 7 months pregnant, alone, and the storm that was trying to tear my cabin apart wasn't half as violent as the one inside my heart. Thunder cracked across the Montana sky, lighting up my little workshop at the edge of Timber Creek. Rain hammered the windows, a frantic drumbeat to the steady scrape of my carving knife. The year was 1887, and while the rest of the world slept, I worked. My name is Eleanor Woodson. Most folks just call me Ellie. The lamplight cast a long, swollen shadow of me on the wall. 7 months. The little one inside me gave a kick, a tiny pulse of life in the lonely quiet. Almost there, I whispered. I wasn't talking to the baby. I was talking to the leg. It was oak, carved and shaped with a skill my father had beaten into my hands. This wasn't just a peg leg. This was a work of art. It had articulated joints, smooth curves, and fine carvings of ivy that wrapped around the calf. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I was making it for no one. It was a strange thing to be carving, I know. A prosthetic leg in the middle of the night with no customer to claim it. But my father's voice was a ghost that never left my workshop. A craftsman must always be prepared, Ellie. You never know when someone will need what only your hands can create. He'd been gone 4 years, taken by consumption, but his lessons were as real as the calluses on my fingers. Sergeant Samuel Woodson, master woodworker, a hero of the Union Army's 47th Regiment, or at least he was a hero once. Lightning flashed, and for a second I was back there. My father, frail and thin in his bed, his voice a dry rasp. The Timber Creek map, Ellie. Find it. Restore our honor. They called me a deserter, a thief, but the truth is in the map. The memory vanished. I was alone again, with the storm, the half-finished leg, and the other project I couldn't bear to complete. In the corner stood a baby's cradle. The sides were intricately carved with little birds and rabbits, but the headboard was a smooth, blank piece of pine. Finishing it felt too final. It would make the baby real. It would make my shame real. Timber Creek had already made its judgment. An unwed mother was a scandal. Being the daughter of a disgraced soldier, that was a damnation. His name was William Harrove, a traveling salesman with a charming smile and words as sweet as honey. He promised me the world, and I, lonely and naive, believed him. By the time I knew about the baby, he was long gone. My letters came back, unopened. Another crash of thunder right overhead. It shook the very foundation of the cabin. And then I heard it, a sound that wasn't the storm, a frantic, desperate pounding on my front door. My blood ran cold. Nobody came calling this late, especially not in a storm like this, and the few who might had no good intentions. I set down my tools, my hands sliding under the workbench. My fingers found the cold, heavy steel of my father's old Navy revolver. I cocked the hammer, the click loud in the sudden silence between thunderclaps. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. A man's voice answered, strained and weak. "Help! Please! I'm shot!" I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to ignore the plea. A lone woman, pregnant, miles from town? Opening the door to a strange man in the middle of the night was a recipe for a shallow grave. But my father's other voice whispered to me, "A person's character isn't measured by how they treat those who can help them, but by how they treat those who can't." Damn him, damn his lessons. I unbolted the door. The wind tore it from my hand, slamming it back against the wall. A man was slumped on my porch, soaked to the bone. A dark stain was spreading across his shoulder, but that wasn't what made me gasp. His right leg was gone. It ended in a stump at the knee. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. I tucked the revolver into my apron and rushed to help him. He was heavy, leaning on me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sorry," he mumbled as I dragged him inside, leaving a trail of blood and rainwater on my floor. Nowhere else to go. "You're at Ellie Woodson's place," I told him, easing him into my father's big chair by the stove. He was maybe 40, his face carved by hardship, with a long, faded scar down his cheek. Even hurt and half drowned, he had an air about him. A man used to being in charge. "Robert," he said. "Just Robert, no last name." That was a red flag right there. You've been shot, I said, looking at his shoulder. Through and through. Missed the bone. Had worse, he grimaced. I can see that, I said, nodding at his missing leg. The war. He just nodded, his face pale. As I cleaned and bandaged the fresh bullet wound, I noticed something glinting on a chain around his neck. A tarnished silver pocket watch. The lamplight caught the engraving on the case. My breath caught in my throat. I could have sworn I saw it. 47th Regiment. My father's regiment. The same one that had branded him a deserter. My hand stopped working. Robert's hand immediately closed over the watch, hiding it. Keepsake, he grunted, tucking it back into his shirt. From another life. I didn't push. Not yet. Questions were piling up in my head like firewood for the winter. I finished with his shoulder and turned my attention to his leg. The stump was old, well healed. A surgeon's work. Where's your crutch? I asked. Lost it when they ambushed me on the ridge. Mason's Ridge? I frowned. Nothing up there to ambush someone for. His eyes, a sharp, steely gray, met mine for a second. Maybe they thought I was carrying something valuable. There was a story here, a big one, but he was weak, bleeding, and exhausted. The questions could wait. You need to rest, I said, helping him to the small cot in the corner. As I turned to go, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. Why? He asked, his voice a low gravel. Why help a stranger? I could be anyone. I looked him straight in the eye. I looked at his missing leg. My father taught me to help those who need it, I said. Besides, I have a feeling you've seen enough trouble for one lifetime. I pulled my wrist free and went back to my workbench. I picked up my tools and went back to work on the oak leg. I could feel his eyes on me. The rhythmic scrape of my knife on the wood was the only sound. That's fine work, he said after a long time. Never seen a prosthetic so elegant. It's not finished, I said without looking up. Who's it for? My hands paused for a fraction of a second. I took a breath. Whoever needs it. I worked through the night. The storm outside died down, and the quiet of the coming dawn settled over the valley. Robert slept, his breathing deep and even, and under my hands the leg took its final shape. It was more than functional. It was beautiful. A testament to my father's craft, a piece of art born from seasoned oak. My father would have been proud. The thought brought the familiar ache of grief. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was how he'd gone. Under a cloud of shame. Deserter. Thief. The words were like a brand on our family name. He'd told me to find the map, to restore our honor, but I had no idea where to even begin. A groan from the cot pulled me from my thoughts. Robert was awake, his face tight with pain. Good morning, I said, setting the leg aside. How's the shoulder? I've had worse, he repeated, the man's favorite phrase, it seemed. I appreciate your hospitality, Miss Woodson. I'll be on my way. You'll be going nowhere, I said firmly. Not for a day, at least. You need rest. A flicker of amusement lit his gray eyes. Are all woodworkers this bossy? Just me, I said, allowing a small smile. And before you go anywhere, I have something for you. I walked to the workbench and brought back the finished leg. I held it out to him. He just stared. His face was a blank mask, unreadable. He took it from me, his hands almost reverent. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood, testing the articulated ankle, tracing the ivy I'd carved into the calf. You made this last night. His voice was rough with emotion. I nodded. Your crutch was gone. The stump is healed well enough. It should fit. I took some measurements while you slept. I can't accept this, he said, but his hands tightened on the leg, holding it like it was a holy relic. This is weeks of work. It's worth a small fortune. It represents one night of doing what I was trained to do, I told him. My father believed our talents aren't really ours. They're gifts meant to be shared when they're needed. I nodded at the leg. You need it. He swallowed hard. At least let me pay you. You can pay me by trying it on. For the next hour I was no longer a woodworker, but a doctor of sorts, fitting and adjusting the prosthetic. I shaved a bit here, tightened a leather strap there, until it moved with his body as if it had grown there. By midday, he was walking around my workshop. Walking, not hobbling, not lurching, walking, with only the slightest limp. It was a miracle my hands had made. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you. It's not enough." "It's enough," I assured him, a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the stove. Just then, the baby gave a powerful kick, and I winced, pressing a hand to my belly. Robert's eyes went to my stomach. "The child's father?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Is he around?" "Gone," I said, the bitterness rising like bile in my throat. "A traveling salesman named William Harrove. He sold patent medicines and empty promises." I hadn't meant to say so much, but there was something about this man, a shared sense of brokenness, that made it easy to talk. Robert's face darkened. "Harrove," he repeated the name slowly. "Patent medicines." My head snapped up. "You know him?" "I've crossed paths with a lot of men," he said, his eyes evasive. "The name just sounds familiar." He glanced out the window. "I should go. I've taken enough of your kindness." "Stay for a meal at least," I offered, surprised that I didn't want him to leave. It had been so long since I'd had company that wasn't judging me. He hesitated, then nodded. Over a simple lunch of bean soup and cornbread, I told him about Timber Creek, about Mayor Crawford, who owned the sawmill, and the Harrison brothers. Walter, the territorial land commissioner, a man who could find a legal problem with any piece of land he wanted, and his younger brother, the Reverend, who preached hellfire and damnation every Sunday. I told him about Sheriff Bennett, a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder. Robert listened, his questions sharp and intelligent. He seemed especially interested in the land around Mason's Ridge, where he'd been ambushed. "That's the old Whitaker claim," I explained. "Abandoned. The Harrisons have been sniffing around it. Walter has a knack for finding irregularities in claims when land becomes valuable." "Corrupt officials are like rats," Robert said, his jaw tight. "Where you see one, there's a dozen more in the walls." As we finished, a wagon rattled by outside. I felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. "You shouldn't be seen here," I said quietly. "Not if you plan on staying. My friendship isn't exactly a benefit in this town." "Because of your condition?" "Because of everything," I said with a tired smile. "My father died in disgrace. I'm unwed and pregnant. I'm a woman doing a man's trade. Take your pick. This town has a long memory for sins, real or imagined." He looked at me for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to see right through the wall I'd built around myself. "Their loss," he said simply. When it was time for him to go, he placed a small, heavy leather pouch on my workbench. "I told you, I can't accept," I started. "Please," he cut me off. "Not as payment, as a gift, a life for a life. You've given me back the ability to stand tall. Let me repay that in the only way I can." Before I could argue, he was gone, walking down the path toward town with his new leg, his new stride. I watched him go, then turned to the pouch. I opened it. My breath hitched. Gold coins. More money than I'd seen in a year. But it wasn't the gold that made my heart stop. Underneath the coins was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. A fragment. Faded ink showed the markings of what could only be a map. In the corner, two things were written. The first was Timber Creek Mine. The second, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, was Sergeant Woodson. My father's name, on a piece of a map, left by a stranger with a watch from the 47th Regiment. My head was spinning. The Timber Creek map, the one my father had told me to find. Was this it? A piece of it? Before I could even process what I was holding, I heard them. Hoofbeats, several riders moving slow. My hands trembled as I shoved the map fragment and the gold into my apron pocket. I peered out the window. Three men, Mayor Crawford, the severe, rail-thin Reverend Harrison, and his older brother, Walter Harrison, the land commissioner. This was not a social call. These men only came when they wanted to cause trouble. I squared my shoulders, walked to the door, and opened it before they could knock. I would not let them see my fear. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice as cool as the creek water, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Walter Harrison dismounted, his movements precise and arrogant. He was dressed in fine clothes, a gold watch chain gleaming on his vest. "Miss Woodson," he began, his smile as thin as a razor's edge, "it has come to our attention that there may be some irregularities in your father's original claim to this land." A block of ice formed in my stomach. "My father's claim is clear. It was filed 20 years ago." "Ah, but was it?" Walter's eyes were cold and reptilian. "Our records show boundary disputes, questions about fees, overlapping claims. Most unfortunate. This was how they worked. This was how they stole land from people who couldn't fight back. They manufactured problems, tied you up in legal knots until you had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar. We are, of course, sympathetic to your situation," the Reverend added, his gaze dropping pointedly to my belly. The meaning was clear. Give up the land, accept the church's charity, and repent for your sins. My face burned with rage. "I assure you, gentlemen, my deed is perfectly legal." "Until now," Walter said, pulling a document from a leather portfolio. "This is an official notice of review. You have 30 days to provide documentation supporting your claim." He held the paper out to me, but before I could take it, a new voice cut through the tension. "Gentlemen, I hope I'm not interrupting." We all turned. It was Robert. He was walking up the path from town, but he was transformed. He wore a new hat, a fine coat. He looked less like a wounded drifter and more like a wealthy businessman. He walked with such confidence on the leg I'd built him that you'd barely notice it wasn't his own. "And you are?" Walter Harrison demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. Robert stepped onto the porch, standing beside me. It was a small gesture, but it felt like he was standing between me and a pack of wolves. "Robert Maxwell," he said, his voice calm and full of authority. "I've been consulting with Miss Woodson about some business matters." My mind raced. Robert Maxwell? Who was Robert Maxwell? "Business matters?" Mayor Crawford sputtered. "Yes," Robert said smoothly. "Miss Woodson's craftsmanship is exceptional. I'm considering establishing a large-scale furniture manufacturing operation here, with her workshop as the centerpiece." Walter Harrison's face soured. "I'm afraid Miss Woodson's property rights are under review, Mr. Maxwell. Any business plans would be premature." "Is that so?" Robert's tone was light, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "How fascinating. These irregularities wouldn't have anything to do with the mineral surveyors who've been seen on the ridge, would they? One might almost suspect a connection." The silence was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mayor Crawford looked like he'd swallowed a bad oyster. "The territorial government is simply ensuring all claims are documented," Walter said stiffly. "I'm sure," Robert said with a smile that held no warmth, "and I'm sure the territorial governor in Helena would be very interested to hear about land commissioners who find convenient irregularities on valuable properties just as they're about to be developed." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Walter's face flushed with anger. Robert reached into his coat and pulled out a small, crisp business card. "My credentials," he said, offering it to Walter. "I have associates in Helena. Powerful associates. They take a keen interest in my business ventures." Walter snatched the card. He glanced at it and the color drained from his face. He paled. He tucked the card into his vest pocket as if it were a venomous snake. "We'll be in touch, Miss Woodson," he said, his voice tight. The three of them mounted their horses and rode away, defeated and furious. When they were gone, I turned to my unexpected savior. "Robert Maxwell?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Furniture manufacturing? What in God's name just happened?" He watched the riders disappear. "Those men were going to steal your land, Ellie. I just gave them a reason to think twice." "By lying?" "Who said I was lying?" he said, turning to face me. His gray eyes were deadly serious. "My name is Robert Maxwell, and I am very interested in your craftsmanship." I stared at him, my head reeling. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the map fragment. "Does your interest have anything to do with this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes widened, just for a second. The mask of calm control slipped. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low. "It was in the pouch you left me, along with my father's name. Sergeant Woodson, 47th Regiment, the same regiment engraved on your watch." I took a step closer, closing the space between us. Who are you, Robert Maxwell? And what do you know about my father? He looked from the map fragment in my hand to my face, and for a long moment he said nothing. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, he let out a long sigh, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. You deserve the truth, he said, but not out here. May I come inside? I hesitated for only a second, then nodded. Whatever game this man was playing, my father was at the center of it, and after 4 years of unanswered questions and whispered lies, I was going to get the truth, even if it killed me. He took off his coat and hung it by the door, a simple domestic act that felt strangely out of place in the middle of all this chaos. You might want to sit down, he said, gesturing to my father's old chair. I'll stand, I said, crossing my arms. Talk. He pulled the silver watch from his pocket and held it out. 47th Regiment, Union Army. It was real. I served with your father, he said. I was a captain. He was a sergeant in a different company, but we knew each other. Samuel Woodson was a good man, an honest man, which is why the official story that he deserted, that he stole regimental funds, it never sat right with me. My heart started to pound. You knew him. I did, and I know he was entrusted with a secret that powerful men would kill to protect. His eyes met mine, and the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us in that small, dusty workshop. Have you ever heard of the Timber Creek treasure? I shook my head, mute. In the last months of the war, he explained, his voice low and urgent, a shipment of Confederate gold was captured by a unit from the 47th. The official story is that the gold was turned over to the Union Army. The truth is that it vanished. The men who took it had grown tired of the war, tired of a government that treated them like cannon fodder. They decided the gold belonged to the soldiers, to the families of the men who had died. My mind flashed back to hushed conversations. My father and his friends from the war, their voices dropping whenever I entered a room. The Timber Creek map, I whispered, the pieces clicking into place. It shows where they hid the gold. Exactly, Robert said. But it was a divided map, torn into pieces and given to the key men involved. No single man could find the treasure alone. Your father, Sergeant Samuel Woodson, was one of those men, and I believe he may have been the last one. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. So when they accused him of stealing, they meant he wouldn't give up his piece of the map. He wouldn't give it up to men who had no right to it, Robert corrected. I finally sank into the chair, my legs too weak to hold me. Who? I asked. Who accused him? Colonel James Harrison, Robert said, and the name landed like a stone. The eldest of the Harrison brothers. He commanded the 47th. He's a powerful man now, with connections all the way to Washington, and he has been hunting for that gold since the war ended. That's why his brothers are trying to take my land, I realized. They think the treasure is buried here. They think your father's piece of the map is here, he said, and I think they're right. A new question burned in my mind. How did you get your piece of the map? Why were you on Mason's Ridge? I made a promise to a dying man, Robert said, his face grim. Lieutenant Jacob Foster. He served under me. He was one of the men who hid the gold. Before he died, he gave me his piece of the map and made me swear I would find the treasure and make sure it went where it was supposed to go. To the families of the fallen, not into the pockets of men like Colonel Harrison. He pulled another yellowed fragment from his vest. It was different from mine, but clearly part of the same map. I've been searching for 3 years, he said, tracking down the men, gathering the pieces. Your father was the last name on my list. You were too late, I said softly. Yes, and no. His gaze swept around my workshop, lingering on my father's tools, on the unfinished cradle. I believe your father left his piece of the map for you, Ellie, hidden somewhere only a true craftsman would think to look. And the Harrisons? They suspected, but they didn't know for sure. That's why they were applying pressure, trying to force me out legally. But they won't stop there, Robert's voice turned grim. The ambush on the ridge proves that. They meant to kill me, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way. We were silent for a long time, the weight of his words settling over us. My father wasn't a traitor. He was a hero, guarding a sacred trust. The Harrisons weren't just greedy landowners. They were killers. And Robert Maxwell, he wasn't just a stranger. He was my only ally in a war I never knew I was fighting. What happens now? I finally asked. His gray eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw a warmth in them, a genuine respect. That depends on you, he said. His gaze dropped to the beautiful oak leg he was wearing, the leg my hands had made. I came here looking for a piece of a map, but I found something else, a reminder of what it means to create instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down. He looked back at me. Your father was a builder, wasn't he? A lump formed in my throat. He was, I whispered. Then I think he would want his daughter to have a chance to build a future. Robert said, his decision made. I will help you find that map. I will help you protect this land. And when we find the treasure, we will honor the promise. We'll use it to care for the families. And if we don't find it, then at least we will have tried to set things right, he said, with a simple dignity that reminded me so much of my father. I stood up and held out my hand, the way you seal a deal. All right, Mr. Maxwell, partners. He took my hand. His was warm and strong. Partners, he agreed. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. In town, the Harrisons were plotting, but they didn't know the game had changed. They didn't know that the craftsman's daughter was no longer alone. Somewhere in my home, hidden in plain sight, was the final piece of the puzzle. The key to a fortune, the key to my father's honor. The treasure was waiting, but first we had to survive the storm that was coming. A storm of greed and violence, far more dangerous than the one that had brought Robert Maxwell to my door. The next week was the calm before that storm. Robert took a room at the hotel in town, playing the part of a wealthy investor. He'd visit my workshop every day, pretending to discuss plans for our furniture business. In reality, we were tearing the place apart. We searched everywhere, through every toolbox, every stack of lumber, every dusty corner, looking for my father's piece of the map. He would have put it somewhere meaningful, I said, sifting through my father's letters for the fourth time. Somewhere safe, but somewhere I would find it. He thought with his hands, Robert mused, carefully examining the spine of my father's old Bible. The hiding place will be clever, something a craftsman would appreciate. The days were tense. Every time a wagon rattled past, we'd freeze, wondering if it was the Harrisons coming to make their next move. The whole town was whispering about the mysterious Mr. Maxwell and his interest in the disgraced woodworker's daughter. We were a spectacle. One afternoon, Robert paused in his search. Tell me about him, Ellie, your father. I stopped, my hand resting on his favorite chisel. He was quiet, I said, the memories bubbling up. He believed a man's work should speak for him. He used to say you had to listen to the wood, that it knew what it wanted to become. You loved him very much. He was all I had, I said simply. And he taught me to live with integrity. That's why their lies hurt so much. Anyone who really knew him knew he could never be a thief. The war changed men, Robert said quietly. Turned some into monsters. Most of us ended up somewhere in between. He had a far-off look in his eyes, a shadow of some old pain. Is that why you disappeared? I asked, my voice soft. He looked at me surprised. You've been busy. I like to know who I'm partnering with, I said. A friend of a friend in Helena looked up your name. Robert Maxwell, a rising star in mining, a beautiful wife, political connections, and then, in 1870, you vanished, presumed deceased. He gave a sad ghost of a smile. He pulled out the watch again, but this time he opened it. Inside the cover was a tiny photograph of a beautiful dark-haired woman. Margaret, he said, my wife. The war. I came back a different man. Not just the leg. He gestured to the prosthetic. I was broken in other ways. She couldn't live with the man I'd become. I threw myself into business, into making a fortune, trying to fill the hole inside me. But it was no good. What changed? Lieutenant Foster, he said, the man who gave me the map. On his deathbed, he gave me a purpose again, a promise to keep. So I liquidated my assets, gave half to Margaret, and I became a ghost. I've spent the last 3 years hunting for this treasure, for justice. He looked at me, his eyes full of a fierce resolve. You were the last piece of the puzzle, Ellie. Just as he finished, we heard a horse outside. My heart leaped into my throat, but then I saw who it was, and relief washed over me. Thomas Nordegren, an old Norwegian trapper, and maybe the only true friend I had left in Timber Creek. He was a mountain of a man, weathered and tough, who cared more for a straight aim and an honest deal than for town gossip. He stomped onto the porch, his face grim. Ellie, girl, got news. His pale blue eyes flicked to Robert. This the Maxwell fellow? He's a friend, Thomas. You can speak freely. The old trapper nodded. Been up on Mason's Ridge. Saw men, not locals. Armed, got surveying gear, but they look more like hired guns. And they were asking questions about this place, about your father. Robert and I exchanged a look. Harrison's men. They were done with legal notices. When was this? Robert asked. Yesterday, Thomas said. And there's more. He paused and his eyes filled with a sympathy that made my stomach clench. Heard talk in town. William Harrove is back. The floor fell out from under me. William. Here. Arrived yesterday, Thomas continued, his voice gruff. Saw him myself. Talking to Walter Harrison outside the land office. Looked real friendly. Robert's hand landed on my shoulder, a steadying weight. It clicked into place, the last ugliest piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a coincidence. He was looking for the map, I said, my voice a dead, hollow thing. That's why he came here. That's why he... I couldn't say it. The seduction, the promises, my own foolish heart. It had all been a lie, a calculated, cruel performance to get close to my father's things. To me, the child inside me, my baby, was just a byproduct of their greed. A cold, clean rage I had never felt before rose up in me. I'll kill him, I whispered. Thomas is right, Robert said, though his eyes were black with a fury that mirrored my own. Revenge can wait. We need to find that map. Now. After Thomas left, promising to keep an eye on the ridge, I went back to my father's workbench. I was numb, betrayed in a way that cut deeper than just a broken heart. Robert came and stood beside me. He would have hidden it somewhere methodical, he said gently. Something only you would understand. I closed my eyes, trying to think like my father. Orderly, precise, deliberate. He valued his tools above all else. Not just any tools. My eyes snapped open. The cabinet, I breathed, his special tools. Behind the workbench was a small, locked cupboard my father had built into the wall. It didn't hold his everyday hammers and saws. It held his treasures, the delicate precision instruments of a master craftsman. The lock was a wooden puzzle he'd designed himself, a sequence of pressure points only he and I knew. My fingers flew over the wood, pressing the secret spots. With a soft click, the cabinet door swung open. Inside, on velvet-lined shelves, lay the tools. I lifted them out one by one, my hands shaking. Calipers, gauges, imported chisels so fine you could shave with them. At the very bottom was a small wooden box, inlaid with an intricate geometric pattern, his measuring devices. It felt heavier than I remembered. I set it on the workbench and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, were his finest instruments. But I saw it immediately, a tiny gap along the edge of the velvet lining, a false bottom. With trembling fingers, I lifted the tray. And there it was. Folded neatly in the hidden compartment was another piece of yellowed paper, the final piece of the Timber Creek map. I carefully unfolded it. Robert leaned over my shoulder, so close I could feel the warmth of his body. The map fragment showed more tunnels, more passages beneath Mason's Ridge. But this piece had something more. In my father's precise script, written in the corner, was a message. A riddle meant only for me, for Eleanor. The truth lies where timber meets stone. It's a message, Robert said softly, his final message to you. Where timber meets stone, it could mean anything. A place where the forest met a rock face. A building with a stone foundation and wood frame. Or, look, Robert said, pointing at the map. He laid all three pieces together. They formed a labyrinth of mine shafts. These symbols, they're military shorthand. Your father was marking a specific route through the mines. He traced a path with his finger through the maze of tunnels. It led to a large chamber deep inside the ridge. And the symbol marking that chamber, it was a drawing of a crossed pick and shovel, sheltered by a tree. Timber, stone, the miner's tools, and the tree. That's it, I breathed. That's the place. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent jab, as if agreeing with us. This child, conceived in a lie, was now pointing us toward the truth. But as the excitement surged through me, we heard it. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Not one horse, a dozen. They were coming, and they were coming fast. Harrison, I whispered, my blood turning to ice. I looked at Robert, at the map spread on the table. We had the answer, but it was too late. Or was it? The back door, I said, grabbing the map fragments. It leads to the creek. There's a path. Pounding erupted on the front door, so hard the whole cabin shook. Miss Woodson, Walter Harrison's voice boomed. We know you're in there. Open this door. Robert was already grabbing his coat, shoving ammunition into his pockets. He checked the pistol he'd taken from one of the men who'd ambushed him. His face was a grim, determined mask. Go, he said. Get to Thomas's hunting cabin. It's 3 miles up the creek. I'll hold them off. No, I said, grabbing my father's revolver from under the bench. We go together. The front door crashed open with the splintering sound of wood giving way. Shouts echoed through my home. There was no more time for arguing. We slipped out the back door just as they stormed into the workshop. We ran, or I ran as fast as a 7 months pregnant woman could run. We scrambled down the bank to the creek, the icy water shocking my legs. On the other side, we plunged into the woods, the pre-dawn darkness our only cover. Behind us, we could hear them shouting, realizing we were gone. The hunt had begun. The journey to Thomas's cabin was a nightmare. Every step was an agony. My back ached, my feet were soaked and frozen, and the baby felt like a lead weight in my belly. But we kept moving, pushing deeper into the forest. We finally stumbled into the clearing where the small hunting cabin stood. It was empty. Robert hadn't made it yet. Had he been caught? Had he? No, I couldn't think like that. I let myself inside the cold, one-room cabin and collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath. I laid the map pieces on the rough wooden table. Where timber meets stone. We had the location. Now we just had to get there. An hour later, I heard a single horse approaching. I grabbed the revolver, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peeked through a crack in the door. It was Robert. He was safe. Relief washed over me so powerfully my knees went weak. I opened the door. They came at dawn, I said, the words tumbling out. William Harrov was with them. I saw, he said grimly, tying his horse. I led them on a chase through the woods, then doubled back. We don't have much time. He came inside and we spread the map out on the table. The military symbols my father had used were a secret language, but Robert could read it fluently. He's marked a path, Robert said, his finger tracing the lines. A safe route through the unstable parts of the old mine. It leads here, to this large natural cavern that intersects the man-made tunnels. Timber meets stone. The man-made timber, supports of the mine meeting the natural stone of the cavern. It had to be it. We go now, I said, getting to my feet. We have to get there before they do. Ellie, it will be dangerous, he warned. In your condition. My condition is the reason we have to do this, I said, my hand on my belly. This is for my child's future, for my father's name. He looked at me, and I saw that flicker of admiration in his eyes again. Samuel Woodson's daughter, through and through, he murmured. We packed what little we had, a lantern, some water, the maps, our guns. As we were about to leave, we heard voices in the distance. A search party. They must have found my tracks leading from the creek. We have to move, Robert said, his voice low. Now. We slipped out the back of the cabin and started climbing the steep slope of Mason's Ridge. The forest was thick, our only ally. Behind us, the shouts grew louder. They were closing in. An hour of hard climbing brought us to the base of a rocky cliff face. Hidden behind a curtain of overgrown brush was a dark opening, An old forgotten mine entrance. This is it, Robert said, consulting the map. He lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back against a darkness that felt ancient and absolute. Once we go in, there's no turning back, he said, his eyes searching mine. I'm not turning back, I said. He nodded and ducked into the tunnel. I followed him into the belly of the earth. The air was cold and stale. The only sound was the drip of water and the scuff of our boots on the rocky floor. Robert led the way, the lantern light dancing on the rough-hewn walls, the map in his hand. We followed the path my father had marked, twisting and turning through a maze of passages. Twice we came to junctions where the tunnel split. Both times Robert consulted the coded symbols and chose a path. He marked the weak supports, Robert whispered. This route avoids the most dangerous sections. After what felt like an eternity, the narrow tunnel began to widen. The air changed, feeling more open. We're close, Robert said. The passage opened up into a cavern so vast the lantern light couldn't reach the ceiling. It was breathtaking. All around us were incredible natural stone formations, stalactites hanging like stone icicles. And where our tunnel entered the cavern, great, thick timber beams held the rock at bay. Where timber meets stone. My father's riddle. This was the place. We moved toward the center of the cavern, and then we saw it. An iron box, about 2 feet square, sitting on the cavern floor. It was rusted and ancient. The treasure. After all these years, Robert breathed, I knelt beside it. The lock was a mass of rust. As Robert pulled out a small kit of tools and began to work on it, I explored the cavern. Against the far wall, I found something that made me stop dead. A small makeshift shrine. A flat rock with a battered tin cup, a tarnished Union Army button, and a folded American flag. Robert, I called softly. He came over. We stood there in silence. This wasn't just a bandit's horde. This was a memorial, a tribute to their fallen comrades. Then we heard it, the echo of voices coming from the tunnel we just left, the scuff of boots, the bobbing lights of lanterns. They had followed us. Robert, hurry, I whispered, my hand going to my revolver. He worked frantically at the lock. The lights grew brighter, the voices clearer. I could make out Walter Harrison's arrogant tone. With a final rusty groan, the lock gave way. Robert threw open the lid. Inside were canvas bags heavy with the unmistakable clink of gold coins, and on top of them, a leather-bound journal. 47th Regiment. Robert grabbed the journal just as the first figures emerged from the tunnel. Walter Harrison stood there, a triumphant smirk on his face. Behind him were Sheriff Bennett, 2 hired guns, and the man I never wanted to see again. William Harrove. Well, well, Walter said, his eyes gluttonous as they fixed on the open box. You've saved us a great deal of trouble, Captain Maxwell. Robert stood up, placing me behind him, the journal held tight in his hand. It's over, Harrison. This journal proves everything. Your brother's theft, your father's innocence. Official records can be rewritten, Walter sneered. He nodded to the sheriff. Secure the treasure and take that journal. As Bennett moved toward us, I raised my father's revolver and aimed it squarely at his chest. That's far enough. The cavern went dead silent. William Harrove laughed. Really, Eleanor? You're going to shoot the father of your child? He took a step forward. No, wait. I'm the father of your child. He's the one you're going to shoot. Don't test me, William, I said, my voice shaking with rage. Just then, from a dark tunnel on the other side of the cavern, a new voice spoke. Seems to me the lady ain't as outnumbered as you thought. We all spun around. Thomas Nordegren stepped out of the shadows, his big hunting rifle leveled directly at Walter Harrison's heart. The standoff was electric. Me with my pistol on the sheriff, Thomas with his rifle on Harrison, Robert guarding the gold and the truth. You're making a mistake, old man, Walter hissed. Suddenly the cavern groaned, a deep, angry rumble from the rock itself. Dust rained down from the ceiling. This whole mine is unstable, Thomas said calmly. One gunshot could bring the whole mountain down on our heads. Then let's be reasonable, Robert said, his voice of command cutting through the tension. He held up the journal. The gold goes back to Helena. This journal goes to the governor. Samuel Woodson's name is cleared. You walk away. And if I refuse, Walter snarled. Another louder groan. A huge chunk of rock broke free from the ceiling and crashed to the floor, sending tremors through the ground. One of the hired guns panicked. We gotta get out of here, he yelled. And then the world exploded. With a deafening roar, the tunnel we'd entered through collapsed. A wall of rock and dust sealed it completely. We were trapped. In the chaos, Robert grabbed my arm. This way, he yelled, pulling me toward the tunnel Thomas had come from. We ran. Behind us, Harrison and his men were scrambling for the gold, their greed overriding their fear. The new tunnel was steep and narrow. My lungs burned. The baby was a dead weight. My body screamed in protest. Your father showed me this way out, Thomas gasped as we climbed. An emergency exit. My father had planned for everything. The sounds of the collapsing mine echoed behind us. We had to keep moving. But a sharp, searing pain shot through my abdomen, so intense it buckled my knees. I cried out. Robert was at my side in an instant. What is it? The baby, I gasped, clutching my stomach. It's coming. His face went pale. Thomas let out a string of Norwegian curses. We can't stop. They're still behind us. Just then, we heard a rifle shot echo up the tunnel. Harrison's men were coming. We keep moving, Robert said, his voice a steel rod of determination. He half carried me the rest of the way. We stumbled out of the tunnel and onto a narrow ledge high on the side of the mountain. We were out. We were alive. But the pain came again, stronger this time. I was in labor. Real labor. My cabin, Thomas said, pointing toward the tree line. We can get the horses. We scrambled down the mountain. Behind us, Harrison and his men emerged from the mine. They saw us. More shots rang out. We reached Thomas's cabin, his horses stomping nervously in the corral. I'll lead them off, Thomas said, swinging onto his horse. You two, ride north. Get to Miller Station. There's a doctor there. Thomas, no, I cried. Your pa was a good man, he said, his weathered face set in grim lines. I don't forget a debt. And with a war cry, he spurred his horse and charged back toward Harrison's men, firing his rifle, drawing them away from us. Robert lifted me onto the other horse and climbed up behind me. We rode north as fast as we dared. Every jolt was an agony. The contractions were coming faster and faster. By nightfall, we were miles away, but I couldn't go on. The baby was coming now. Robert found a sheltered spot by a creek. He built a small fire. He made me as comfortable as he could on his coat. I'm no doctor, he said, his face illuminated by the firelight, his eyes full of a terrifying mixture of fear and resolve. But I'm not leaving you. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and pushing, and Robert's calm, steady voice guiding me through it. And then under a blanket of a million stars, in the middle of the Montana wilderness, my daughter was born. Her first cry cut through the night, the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A girl, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. He wrapped her in his own shirt and laid her on my chest. She was so small, so perfect. Tears streamed down my face. I looked from my tiny daughter to the man who had delivered her. The stranger who had stumbled to my door, bleeding and broken. The man who had saved my life, my father's honor, and now my child. He gently touched the baby's hand, and her tiny fingers wrapped around his. A look of pure wonder crossed his face. As the dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, he looked at me. The fire had died down to embers. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in my arms. Ellie, he said, his voice quiet and serious, I know this is not the time or the place, but what happened last night, bringing her into the world with you, it changed me. I've been running from my past for years. I don't want to run anymore. I want to build something. He took a deep breath. Marry me. I stared at him, speechless. My mind was a whirlwind. Marriage? To him? But then I looked down at my daughter, Sarah. I would call her Sarah Hope, because that's what she was. A tiny, fierce spark of hope in a world of darkness. And this man, Robert Maxwell, he was a part of that hope. We made it to Miller Station that afternoon. Thomas was there safe and sound, having led Harrison's men on a wild goose chase. The doctor pronounced me and the baby healthy. The next day in a small dusty church, with Thomas and the doctor as our witnesses, Robert and I were married. He placed a simple gold band on my finger. It wasn't a marriage of passion, not yet. It was a partnership, a fortress we were building around our strange new family. A telegram came from the territorial governor. He would meet with us in Helena. We rode out of Miller Station the next morning, me and my daughter Sarah, in a wagon driven by Thomas. My husband Robert, riding alongside, tall and proud on the leg my hands had built. The journal that held the truth was tucked safely in his coat. The fight wasn't over. We still had to face the governor. We still had to bring the Harrisons to justice. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid. My father had taught me to listen to the wood, to find the beauty hidden inside. But Robert, he taught me something else. He taught me that sometimes the most broken pieces can be put back together to create something stronger and more beautiful than you ever could have imagined. We were a family forged in secrets and violence, but we were going to build a future carved from truth and honor. The road to Helena was long, but we were ready. The governor listened. He read the journal. He saw the truth in our eyes. Warrants were issued. Walter and the Reverend Harrison were arrested in Timber Creek. William Harrove was caught trying to flee the territory, and a federal marshal was sent to find and arrest the decorated war hero, Colonel James Harrison. The Timber Creek treasure was recovered, and every last dollar went to where it was intended, to the families of the men who had given their lives for their country. My father's name, Sergeant Samuel Woodson, was officially cleared. He was declared a hero, his honor restored for all time. We returned to the small cabin on the edge of the creek. It wasn't just my home anymore. It was our home. Robert used his old connections to start the furniture business he joked about, and my craft found a new purpose. And in the corner of the workshop, I finally finished the cradle, carving my daughter's name, Sarah Hope Maxwell, into the headboard. It's funny. My life began with a storm, a stranger, and a secret. But in the end, it was those very things that gave me everything I'd ever wanted. A family, a future, and the truth. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption from the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done if a bleeding stranger showed up at your door in the middle of a storm?